This is the overview of the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is the first of the 12 historical books in the Bible, which go from Joshua through the book of Esther. The book of Joshua actually forges a link between the Pentateuch and the remainder of Israel's history. Think back with me as to the flow at this point. In Genesis, we find the election of the nation Israel through Abraham. In Exodus, we find the redemption of the nation as Israel was delivered out of bondage to Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea and were given God's law. In Leviticus, we find the sanctification of the nation as Israel was taught how to worship God in view of his holiness. And in Numbers, we find the direction and the wandering of the nation as they were tested and numbered as a nation. In Deuteronomy, we find the instruction of the nation as the law was reviewed and reiterated. In Joshua, as we come to our book today, we find the possession by the nation as Israel crossed over the land of Jordan and conquered the land. Now, Israel's ownership of the land was unconditional under the terms of the Abrahamic covenant. However, Israel's actual possession of the land was conditional. It was based upon their faith and obedience. They would have to act in faith and take the land that God had promised. Well, what's the context for the book of Joshua? Well, as the book of Joshua begins, Moses is dead. And the nation Israel is poised to take possession of the land that their forefathers had anticipated for 400 years. They are camped at the eastern bank of the Jordan River, not too far from the city of Jericho. As a nation, they had already spent 400 years in slavery in Egypt, and they had just spent 40 years wandering in the desert. The generation that had come out of Egypt has died. And now their descendants are ready to experience the fulfillment of what God has promised. The events which unfold in the book of Joshua span only about 25 years. The conquest of the land took less than 7 years. And Joshua's final address and death at the end of the book came about 20 years later. Now, the book of Joshua records numerous military campaigns against the inhabitants of the land. So in one sense, as you read through the book of Joshua, it's really a military history. It chronicles the possession and the occupation of the land. The land which God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was literally infested with godless and vile pagan people who needed to be driven out of this land. So it is a book about war, and the battles are brutal. And like most military histories, it focuses on the commander of the army. For this unique war, the commander wasn't Joshua, it was God himself. Joshua 5 verse 15 says, "And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, 'Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy.' And Joshua did so, in recognition that it was the Lord who was the commander." By the way, if you're ever interested in seeing sort of a chronicling or listing of all of the people, the inhabitants of the land that they fought against, there's a really good reference in the MacArthur Study Bible that lays out everyone from the Hittites to the Canaanites to the Girgashites. That might be a great resource for you. Well, the book of Joshua repeatedly emphasizes that the victories that God's people experienced were due to God's intervention. In Deuteronomy 6, verses 10 and 11, God had promised that his people would live in cities that they didn't build, that they would enjoy fields that they hadn't planted, and they would harvest fruit that they had not tended. And so a unique feature of Israel's conquest is that they actually only destroyed 3 cities. They destroyed Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. And most of the battles were fought outside of the cities, away from the fields that contained crops. So when they inhabited the land, They dwelt in cities that they didn't build, and they ate of fruit that they hadn't planted. Now, the book of Joshua records a crucial lesson for God's people, and it's this, that victory doesn't come through numerical superiority or military strength. Victory comes only through faith in God and obedience to his word. The theme of the book of Joshua is the theme of faithfulness. Exodus is the story of God leading his people out of Egypt, and Joshua is the story of God leading his people into the promised land. He would faithfully complete the good work he began despite their unbelief and faithlessness. The theme of God's faithfulness is underscored by the name of the book itself. The word Joshua means Yahweh is salvation. As a young man, Joshua had been Moses' accompaniment, his attendant, his servant on Mount Sinai, and he constantly attended the tent of the Lord out in the wilderness. Joshua, along with Caleb, were actually the only ones of their generation who saw the promised land. This was because 38 years earlier, back in Numbers chapter 14, they expressed faith that God would help them conquer the land. Well, the amazing thing about Joshua is that while he had an incredible ministry as the general of Israel, his most prominent ministry was in his latter years, as we find in the book of Joshua. The key verse for this book is in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 3, where God tells Joshua, "Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses." Well, as the nation entered the land of promise, their lives would never be the same. Think about this transition. Rather than meals of manna, they would now eat of the fruit of the land. Rather than wandering in the wilderness, their lives would now be characterized by conquering in the land. Rather than being led by the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of smoke by the day, now they would be directed by the word of God. From now on, there would be no more tents. Now they would live in houses that they did not build. One unique feature in the book of Joshua is the mention of 6 different monument stones that actually point to something that God had done. These piles of stones served as reminders of God's faithfulness. Well, who wrote Joshua? Well, while Joshua's death and burial that are recorded in chapter 24 were obviously added later by other writers, Joshua wrote most of the book. In Joshua 24:26, it said, "And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God." How is the book of Joshua organized? This will be helpful as you read through, because as you read through Joshua, you'll find that it's divided into 3 sections. The first section is in chapters 1 through 12. This records sort of the conquest of the land. Then in chapters 13 through 21, this records the colonization of the land, the people filling it. And then in chapters 22 through 24, we see the conditions for the ongoing occupation of the land. So the first section of Joshua in chapters 1 through 12 chronicle the conquest of the land. That's the predominant feature in those chapters. The first 5 chapters begin east of the Jordan River. It's not even in the land. In chapter 1, God replaces Moses with Joshua and promises that he will be with him. And to show that he was with the people, God miraculously stops the Jordan River waters. And the people are able to cross into Jordan actually on dry land. In other words, just as he had parted the Red Sea for their parents as they left Egypt, God now parts the Jordan River for them as they enter the land. Now, under Joshua's leadership, the people of Israel entered the land of Canaan in about 1405 BC. In chapters 6 through 12, we find 3 major military campaigns which reveal a carefully orchestrated strategy. In fact, it's brilliant as you look at it. When they entered the land, you'll find they went right into the middle of the land and cut off the northern and the southern people from sort of grouping together. So their first campaign was right in the center of the land. Then in the second campaign that we find in chapters 9 through 10, Joshua led Israel into the southern part of the land and conquered that. And then in chapters 11 and 12, Israel's armies moved into the northern area and conquered that. So at the end of this section, God told Joshua that very much of the land still needed to be possessed. They had conquered, but they didn't conquer everyone. The second section of the book of Joshua chronicles how the land was colonized. This is chapters 13 through 24. Now, after the conquest of the land, specific real estate was assigned to the various tribes of Israel. In fact, as you read through this, some people find it incredibly boring because they think it reads like a title deed, because the boundaries of the land are given as well as the allocation of land for the specific tribes. It might help you as you read this to read it with a map open to see where the various tribes were allocated. There's four notable sections, details provided in this section. First, it tells us the boundaries. And we find the boundaries for the people of God stretched from the Jordan River to the east, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea on the west. We find that the boundaries stretched north and south between the Sinai Peninsula, all the way to the ancient nation of Phoenicia. The land was allotted to all of the tribes except for one. That is the tribe of Levi. Levi's portion went to the two sons of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. Chapters 13 chronicles the occupation of the land that was east of Jordan. Chapters 14 through 19 chronicle the occupation of the land west of the Jordan. And then chapters 20 and 21 chronicle the designation for the legal and religious purposes. There was allocation of cities called cities of refuge, and there were 6 of them. These provided haven for people who maybe had committed manslaughter. They're working out in a field and somebody's cart rolls over somebody else and kills them. They were able to flee to a city of refuge. This was necessary because of the avenger of blood, the relative who would come to want to exact blood. Eligibility for refuge in one of these cities would be determined by a judge, and the person would go there, and he'd have to live in that city of refuge. In chapter 21, there's 48 cities that are designated to the priestly tribe, the tribe of Levite. They weren't given any land, but they were allowed to live in certain cities. Well, then we come to the final section in the book of Joshua, and that is the conditions for continued occupation in the land. This is chapters 22, 23, and 24. These chapters consist of Joshua doing 2 things. First, he addressed the people, or the leaders of the people, and then secondly, he gave a general address to all the people. Well, in chapter 23, Joshua rehearses the mighty acts of God on Israel's behalf by giving them the land. And Joshua addressed the people, the leaders of the people, about all the things that God had done. And he exhorted the future leaders to continue to be faithful. Then in chapter 4, he addresses the whole assembly of the people. And what's exciting about this chapter is it records a covenant renewal ceremony in which Israel commits herself to serve the Lord and to reject the worship of all the false gods. So when you get to the book of Judges and you're in Joshua with this commitment to not follow the idols and the gods of the people in the land, but to follow God, it's a shock when you see the spiral as people continue to flee from God, rebel against God, and serve and the other idols. Well, the last few verses of Joshua narrates 3 burials. Joshua's burial, Joseph from Genesis, his bones were carried with them through the wanderings. He is buried, and Eleazar the high priest is buried. All 3 of these men were associated with Israel's days in captivity. And the fact that they were buried in the land of promise is a witness to God's faithfulness. So, in Joshua, God has given his people a land. However, the people failed to possess the land completely by allowing some inhabitants to remain. The Canaanite peoples would become a really damning influence on Israel as the years went by. The significance of the book of Joshua is that it shows the geographical boundaries for each tribe of Israel. But it also serves as the connecting narrative between the days of Moses and the days of the judges during which the book was first circulated. One of the main points of application in the book of Joshua, as you read, is that God is faithful. Just as he was with Israel as they followed him, so too is he with you. As you read through Joshua, what are some of the things that you can look for? Well, first, I want you to notice how God fulfills his promises. Now, in Genesis, God had promised Abraham's descendant that they would inherit a land. The book of Joshua documents this promise victoriously being fulfilled against all odds. Folks, God is still a covenant-keeping God. In spite of all of their failures, he keeps his promise, which tells us God will keep his promise in the future. As you read this book, secondly, notice what God does for his people. When the people trusted God, God fought their battles. This is amazing. As you look at how God provided for them, it was God in chapter 3 who dried up the Jordan River. It was God who in chapter 6 caused the walls of Jericho to fall down. It was God in chapter 8 who gave the winning strategy to Joshua. In chapter 10, it was God who stopped the sun for Israel to have more time. And for you in your life, it is God who is at work in you so that he can do and will according to his good purpose. Enjoy your study, your reading through the book of Joshua.